Hello, everyone. My name is Travis Campbell, and you are watching Notes On with Travis and Ross. As you can see, my partner Ross is not with us. He is traveling right now, so he could not join us this morning. And so this morning, I would like to just do a brief lesson, maybe a sense of encouragement to all of you who wonder about these things. What do Christians in the past think about some of the subjects that Ross and I like to discuss? And so I'm going to do a brief lesson on some of the content that I'm going to be presenting at the Southern Evangelical Seminary's National Conference, the Steadfast Conference, that will be taking place in Rock Hill, South Carolina on October the 13th and 14th. I want to encourage all of you who are close to Rock Hill or in the Charlotte area or in South Carolina or Tennessee to try to make it at that conference. And if you can't make it in person, to go on the SES website and zoom in. There are going to be a lot of great speakers, including Frank Turek and Gary Habermas. Gary Habermas, one of the leading defenders of the resurrection, will be doing a presentation there. And he is, I believe, going to be coming out with his new magnum opus, really, on the resurrection. I believe it's going to be about 1,500 pages. It will be coming out in the spring. Frank Turek is always a great speaker, and the conference is going to have many more. My good friend Richard Howe, who has appeared on this show, is going to be there. Ross and I will be there. We might even do a show from the conference. So I want to just strongly encourage you to tune in. So get your tickets and show us some support. Apologetics is in an interesting period of, I think, growth. We have more people out there engaged in the act and art and science of defending the faith than ever before. And I think it's important that we, as we defend the faith, look into our roots. And so the paper that I'm going to be presenting is entitled Steadfast in Their Apologetic: How the Magisterial Reformers Defended Classical Theism. And the quotation that I would like all of you to consider as we look at what the Protestant reformers thought about how to defend their faith is the famous statement from the Belgic Confession of Faith. And this is what it says about how we know God. We know God, first of all, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, which is before our eyes as a most elegant book, wherein all creatures, great and small, are so many characters leading us to contemplate the invisible things of God. For the Protestant reformers, Augustine, the great saint in North Africa, was one of their guiding lights in trying to understand Scripture and how to integrate it with philosophy and how to understand the great truths of the gospel. And Augustine often said that about creation. He often compared it to a wonderful book. And over and over again, you see the magisterial reformers. When I use that term, I mean the architects of Reformed theology, those who got it going, if you will. The Luthers, the Melanchthons, the Calvins, the Bullingers, and so forth. And in particular, in the Reformed tradition, we have people like Zwingli and Vermigli, and of course, Calvin and Bullinger and Bucer and Farrell. These were titans in the 16th century who articulated for us the forms, the doctrines, and even the mode of much of what we understand Christianity to be, at least Protestant Christianity. The two thinkers that I'm going to highlight this morning for you are Peter Martyr Vermigli and John Calvin. And the 16th century historian French Calvinist Joseph Scaliger said the following about Peter Martyr Vermigli. He said, "The two most excellent theologians of our times are John Calvin and Peter Martyr, the former of whom has dealt with the Holy Scriptures as they ought to be dealt with sincerity, I mean, and purity and simplicity, without any scholastic subtleties. Peter Martyr, because it seemed to fall to him to engage the sophists, has overcome them sophistically and struck them down with their own weapons. In other words, Peter Martyr used the tools of the scholastics against Rome in defense of Reformed theology. And so McClellan, an editor of one of Peter Martyr's works, says this. He says, the methodological judgment of Scaliger should be related to the question of naming Martyr Aristotelian and Thomist. As we have seen, he abandoned neither his early Aristotelianism nor the Thomist theology that built on the philosopher's groundwork. So what McClellan is communicating here is that there is continuity between the medieval theologians like Thomas Aquinas and what the reformers were doing. In particular, they defended the existence of God much like Thomas Aquinas defended the existence of God. We have had various Thomists on our show, people like Gavin Kerr and Richard Howe, who've explained to you who Thomas was. And if you're interested in hearing more about that, you can look at our earlier episodes. We've been putting out shows for over a year now, and it always does my heart good to bring in people from other faith traditions like Gavin Kerr, or someone a little bit more close to home like Richard Howe, to explicate sort of what Thomas was getting at and why he thought you could prove God's existence. Peter Martyr is following in that train in many respects, and I would call him one of several Reformed Thomists. As an illustration of the point that McClellan is trying to make, here are Peter Martyr's comments on Romans 1:19. You'll remember that Romans 1:19, Paul actually says that which is can be known about God is grasped by even the pagans. And then he goes on to say in verse 20 that God has made his existence evident through the things he has made. Here's what Vermigli says about Romans 1. We gather from this verse that all truth comes from God, for it does not spring from us. But there are two opinions about how it comes from God. Some say that it's because God has made those things by which we can perceive these truths. But others, and these are the ones I prefer, hold that God has planted ideas in our minds. That is, he's implanted anticipations and notions through which we are led to conceive noble and exalted opinions about the divine nature. These ideas of God naturally engrafted in us are daily confirmed and refined by the observation of created things. Others say proudly and wickedly that they have learned these truths from Aristotle or from Plato, giving no thanks whatever to God for them. Be sure these men were agents and instruments, but not authors. They speak much as an Israelite might, saying that he knew the truths of the law, not through God, but through Moses, who was only God's mediator and messenger, relating to the people matters whose author was God. It should be noted that although God is a nature so separated from matter that he cannot be perceived by the senses, yet he regularly declares himself by symbols and what may be called sensible words. These signs, which have declared God to us from the beginning, are themselves creatures. When natural philosophers studied them, they were led to a knowledge of God on account of the wonderful properties and qualities of nature. Knowing the series of causes and the relation to effects, and clearly understanding that it is not proper to posit an infinite progression of these causes, they reasoned that they must arrive at some highest being, and so concluded that there is a God. Plato, Aristotle, and Galen have set forth these matters exceedingly well. We must not neglect the sacred writings. They also have described the same path to us. Notice that while Martyr affirms this idea of a sense of deity, innate ideas that God has planted in our minds, which is famously articulated by his friend John Calvin, he does not see this imprinted knowledge of the divine as a reason for rejecting a secondary, confirmatory knowledge of God, gained through observing nature. Also, he shuns any suggestion that we owe our natural theology or our natural knowledge of God to philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. We owe our natural theology to revelation. And so Plato and Aristotle did not invent, construct, or in any way serve as the foundation for our knowledge of God. Rather, they merely discovered God through the tools that God himself had given them, nature and human reason, which is to say, nature is the material cause of our natural theology, and human reason is the instrumental cause. These tools have been given to all of us by God, the efficient cause of our theology. To say that Plato and Aristotle are the foundation from which we derive our natural theology is as foolish as saying that Abraham and Moses are the foundation from which we derive our sacred theology. No, and again, God is the revealer via either nature or holy writ. Humans merely use their God-given gifts to either receive and discover more truths about God or reject and shun the divine revelation. And you'll notice also that Martyr goes on to give a brief rendition of Thomas's argument for God's existence. As the translator of this text himself says, in the paragraph, Martyr follows the cosmological argument of Thomas Aquinas, an induction from the contingency of worldly phenomena stated classically in the first of Aquinas' 5 ways. Martyr combines two concepts in the natural knowledge of God, innate notions, and the effects of creation. Now, I do have to quibble with the translator here. I don't like the word induction. For Martyr, just as it was for Aquinas, Thomas's arguments for God's existence are not inductive. They are not inductive inferences which, if strong enough, render God's existence more probable than not. Rather, the 5 ways are deductive arguments, which, if sound, prove with certainty the undeniable existence of God. And one of the things that I want to communicate on our show constantly is that God's existence can be proven. The proofs for God's existence are not mere suggestions. They are proofs that God exists. I want you to also notice what Martyr has said. He says that there's a confluence, if you will, a good and necessary synthesis would be another way to put it, between God's revelation in nature and God's special revelation in Scripture. The very same God who's revealed in nature is the very same God revealed in Scripture. The Bible tells us a lot more about God than what we get from nature, but it doesn't tell us less. It reveals to us many things we could never know about God from nature alone. But this does not in any way, shape, or form mitigate nature's sufficiency in revealing God. Martyr himself says this. He says, we could also reason from many other matters, but they may be easily gathered from the writings of both Scripture and philosophers. Therefore, I will add nothing more. I count it sufficient to have said that nothing may be found in the world so abject or lowly that he gives no witness to God. This statement of Martyr's, that every fact we discover in the world reveals God to the human creature, whether it is a galaxy or a grain of sand, just is the heart of not just Thomas Aquinas' theology, but all of Christian theology. For Martyr is saying that everything we observe is finite and changing. And because of that, it needs a cause. And you can't have an infinite regress of these causes and effects. And so this world of finite and changing causes must be ultimately sustained in existence by that which is uncaused, a being which just is everything the theist says about God. And so it can be truly said that nothing in the world is so high or low as to lack this sort of contingency. By contingency, we mean everything that is finite and changing. And this is proof that whatever exists, no matter how abject, is a revelation of God. Everything that exists reveals God to us. What kind of God does Martyr infer from the facts of his experience? Nothing short of the God of classical theism. He says this: every act depends on the first principle of all things. God is pure actuality, he says, as the philosophers acknowledge. Now, not only Martyr, but as many people will tell you, John Calvin himself used similar forms of reasoning when he argued for God's existence. This bears repeating because we live in a time where Calvin scholars are debating one another over what Calvin was trying to do in his institutes when he argued for God's existence. President Thomas Jefferson himself saw Calvin as someone who abandoned proofs for God's existence, or natural theology, that is, a knowledge of God derived from nature. And this is what Thomas Jefferson says about Calvin and Calvinism. He says, I can never join Calvin in addressing his God. He was indeed an atheist, which I can never be. Or rather, his religion was demonism. If ever a man worshipped a false god, he did. The being described in his 5 points, the 5 points of Calvinism, is not the God who you and I worship, acknowledge, and adore. He's talking to John Adams, and he says, Calvin's God is not the God that you and I worship, the creator and benevolent governor of the world, but a demon of malignant spirit. It would be more pardonable to believe in no God at all than to blaspheme him by the atrocious attributes of Calvin. Indeed, I think that every Christian sect gives a great handle to atheism by their general dogma that without a special revelation, there would not be sufficient proof of the being of a God. 1/6 of mankind are supposed to be Christians. The other 5/6 then, who do not believe in the Jewish and Christian revelation, are without a knowledge of the existence of a God. The issue surrounding the 5 points will hold off for another day. Jefferson's critique here is intriguing. He says that any Christian sect that denies natural revelation, or even a natural theology, has basically admitted the very point atheists have always made. There's no genuine evidence for God's existence. We have had people respond to our show on several occasions, and they said, why are you guys engaged in this apologetic stuff? It's all about faith. You have to understand that when you say those kinds of things, you are playing into the atheist's hands. Atheists want an excuse not to believe. And when Christians say to them, there is no proof for God's existence, they are saying the very thing that atheists want to hear. I like to put it this way. Do you think that Satan is more or less happy with the prospect of the possibility of proving God's existence? What if every single Christian knew how to prove that God existed? Do you think Satan would be happy or sad about that fact? Think about it. The Christian who says, there's no evidence, but the Bible tells me so, as I say, has played into the atheist's hands. And this dogma that the only way you can prove God is appealing to the Bible has 2 intolerable consequences. First, it means that the vast majority of human beings are without any knowledge of God. And second of all, it means that God is going to judge everyone for their sins, even though those who lack access to the Bible have no way of knowing anything about God. God punishes people, in other words, for not believing something that they in principle cannot know. That seems a trite unfair. Now, I would like to concede Jefferson's main point. If there is no natural theology, then the main contention of atheism is sound, as few, if any, have ever heard of God. And so it would be unfair for God to judge anyone for not believing in him or even for sinning against the moral law on the day of our respective judgments. The only issue before us is whether or not Jefferson correctly understood Calvin's doctrine of the knowledge of God. And of course, my answer is in the negative. Here's how John Calvin puts the matter. Calvin says, there exists in the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct, some sense of the deity we hold to be beyond dispute, since God himself, to prevent any man from pretending ignorance, has endued all men with some idea of his Godhead, the memory of which he constantly renews and occasionally enlarges, that all to a man being aware that there is a God and that he is their maker may be condemned by their own conscience when they neither worship him nor consecrate their lives to his service. Certainly, if there's any quarter where it may be supposed that God is unknown, the most likely for such an instance to exist is among the dullest tribes farthest removed from civilization. But as the heathen tells us, there is no nation so barbarous, no race so brutish, as not to be imbued with the conviction that there is a God. The heathen that he is referencing is Cicero, the great Roman orator of the 1st century BC. Even those who, in other respects, seem to differ at least from lower animals, constantly retain some sense of religion. So thoroughly has this common conviction possessed the mind, so firmly is it stamped on the breasts of all men. Since then, there never has been, from the very first, any quarter of the globe, any city, any household even, without religion. This amounts to a tacit confession that a sense of deity is inscribed on every heart. No, even idolatry is ample evidence of this fact, for we all know how reluctant man is to lower himself in order to set other creatures above him. Therefore, when he chooses to worship wood and stone rather than be thought to have no God, it is evident how very strong the impression of a deity must be, since it is more difficult to obliterate it from the mind of man than to break down the feelings of his nature. These certainly being broken down when, in opposition to his natural haughtiness, he spontaneously humbles himself before the meanest object as an act of reverence to God. Human experience constantly teaches everyone the truth of Calvin's doctrine of the sense of deity. We have all heard the statement, there are no atheists in foxholes. How many times have I heard a story of a self-proclaimed atheist who, after barely escaping a tragedy, or indeed while he was going through it, finding himself in a church or synagogue praying fervently, or even in his own room, reading a Bible or a devotional in an attempt to find solace or some assurance that there is hope for escape from what has befallen him, or that there is a purpose to his suffering. These fleeting moments of despair or terror, or even the fear of Judgment Day, followed by an overwhelming desire to make things right with God in all of our lives, including the lives of recalcitrant atheists, indicate that deep down there is a knowledge of God firmly planted in the souls of men. For Calvin, the theistic proofs are unnecessary, since everyone already knows God as we emerge from the womb. And yet, as in Peter Martyr, Calvin's doctrine of the sense of deity in all of us did not erase his desire to articulate proofs for God's existence. This is an important point. Some people use the sense of deity that Calvin argued for as a replacement or a reason to shun the idea of proving God's existence. But Calvin does go on to demonstrate that God exists. In fact, Calvin begins his Institutes with an argument for God's existence. This is how he actually starts the entire work, his great work in theology. This is what he says. Our wisdom, insofar as it ought to be deemed true and solid wisdom, consists almost entirely of two parts, the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. But as these are connected together by many ties, It is not easy to determine which of the two precedes and gives birth to the other. For in the first place, no man can survey himself without forthwith turning his thoughts toward the God in whom he lives and moves, because it is perfectly obvious that the endowments which we possess cannot possibly be from ourselves. No, that our very being is nothing else than subsistence or existence in God alone. Calvin's method, as we see here in this passage, is to start with the knowledge of himself as a dependent being, only to realize that he must immediately begin to contemplate the God upon whom he subsists. In other words, in the opening lines of his theological masterpiece, Calvin is giving us a cosmological argument for God's existence. Later in his Institutes, he gives a more explicit argument that reads as follows. He says, I only wish to observe here that this method of investigating the divine perfections by tracing the lineaments of his countenance as shadowed forth in the firmament and on the earth, and notice what he says, is common both to those within and to those without the pale of the church. From the power of God, we are naturally led to consider his eternity, since that from which all other things derive their origin must necessarily be self-existent and eternal. Moreover, if it be asked what cause induced him to create all things at first, and now inclines him to preserve them, we shall find that there could be no other cause than his own goodness. But if this is the only cause, nothing more should be required to draw forth our love toward him. Every creature, as the psalmist reminds us, is participating in his mercy. The psalmist says his mercies are over all of his works. Notice that contrary to Jefferson's assessment of him, Calvin believes there's a natural theology available to everyone inside and outside the church. Those who do and those who do not have access to special revelation. Now, there are multiple historical theologians that confirm this, but I do want to, as time is escaping us, I do want to go to another text where Calvin quotes Virgil, the famous poet. But even before that, Calvin says this. He says, those blessings which unceasingly distill to us from heaven are like streams conducting us to the fountain. Okay, so the blessings all around us in creation, the created order, are streams that conduct us to the fountain. Just as the limnologist is able to trace the waters of a river back to its source, so also God has so constructed the human mind that every one of us is able to trace finite things within the contingent chain of effects back to the source of all being. And as I say, he does quote Virgil the poet, who says, hence to the beast some sages have assigned a portion of the God and heavenly mind, for God goes forth and spreads through the whole, heaven, earth, and sea, the universal soul. Each at its birth from him all beings share, both man and brute, the breath of vital air. To him return and loose from earthly chain, fly whence they sprung and rest in God again. Spurn of the grave and fearless of decay, dwell in high heavens and star the ethereal way. Calvin's continuity with the earliest examples of the Christian tradition on this score is not difficult to establish. His insistence that knowing oneself entails knowing God is earlier given to us by Christian writers such as Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian and Theophilus. His idea of a sense of deity is not unique to him. We see it in those who preceded him, like Zwingli, and those who were contemporary with him, like Peter Martyr and even Heinrich Bullinger. They say, all of the reformers said, that the grand proof of God's existence is grounded in what we already innately know through natural revelation, recovered and reestablished by special revelation. Now, I know that this lesson was maybe heady for you, quite theological. It is something that I had to sort of come up with last minute. I do miss my dear friend Ross, who is my anchor on this show, but I hope you got something out of it. And for those of you that are interested in this topic more, I'll be presenting more in my paper, in my talk at the national conference. I'll be doing. I'm not a featured speaker, but I will be doing a breakout session. And so we will be recording that. And so if you're interested, you can hear more of that later. But that is just a little taste of some of the things that I'll be doing and the kinds of discussions we'll be engaging in at the national conference. I hope to see you there. Miss you, Ross. I wish you were here with me. It's always lonely without you, but I hope you're doing well, and I hope all of you are doing well. Peace to all of you, and come back soon next week.